The 1960s were a great era for photographers, particularly those who were interested in purchasing a single lens reflex camera. So, why am I talking about the 1960s when we're looking at a camera from the 1970s? This is the Minolta SR-T 202, whose roots actually go back into the 1960s with the original SRT series. This camera was one of the ones that I was looking at when I became of camera buying age. And for me, camera buying age was roughly age 13. I talked about in a previous video how I bought my first SLR, the Cosmorex SE500, a rebadged Soviet Zenit model. But what I really wanted was a Japanese SLR. And mostly I wanted a Japanese SLR because they were cheaper than the German cameras. They were still out of reach for somebody on a paperboy salary, which was roughly, I don't know, $7 to $10 a week. Even with my Christmas tips from my paper route, I think I still only had about $130. So a Minolta at that time, or even a Pentax, or one of the many other Japanese cameras, was still out of reach for me. But anyway, let's get back to this story about the Minolta SRT 202. And obviously, this is made by Minolta, one of a number of Japanese camera makers that were taking root in the in the Western photographic scene. The SRT series were full-size cameras offering all the latest features that photographers wanted, and that would include through the lens metering that wasn't stop-down metering, with hot shoes, a good range of shutter speeds, and of course interchangeable lenses. This is one of the final models of the SRT series. This is a 202. I once saw a 303. A fellow had one. It was an all black one. I couldn't convince him to give me the camera. Of course, why should he? Even though I wanted it. Dug it out of a closet, showed it to me with its box, and then put it back into the closet. And so, anyway, that was the story of that camera. From what I understand, the 303 was an overseas market, or I guess I should say that I believe it was sold in the European markets. I don't know if it was sold in the Asian markets as well as the 303. I believe it was identical to the 202. This was a full feature camera and had a number of really good things in it. It looks like there were two versions of this model, one released in 1975 and then a second version, or the final version, released in 1978. This also, I believe, was Minolta's final full-size camera before it began downsizing its cameras, beginning with the X series. So let's jump in and take a look around this camera and talk about why it's still a pretty darn good camera today. Minolta was a bit different because if you notice, all of its lettering was all lowercase, whereas Canon, Nikon, and other camera makers often, spelled it traditionally with with the first letter being a capital letter. Top deck looks rather plain, doesn't it? Over here, we just have a rewind crank, fold out rewind crank. Here's your frame counter. This is your film advance. It's a ratcheted film advance, so you could advance the film in small increments. And it was the film advances pushed a little bit inward, whereas film advances on most cameras are more toward the outer right side of the camera. The shutter release also was placed, well, shutter release was placed where it normally is, and I think it has a somewhat unusual placement, for, at least particularly in a modern day camera. The shutter release is in the middle of the pivot point of the film advance. Immediately to the left is your shutter speed dial, with speeds running from 1/1000 to 1 second plus B. This is your film speed setting dial, and notice that this one was definitely for the Western markets because it's marked as ASA. The film speed range runs from ASA 5 to 6400, which was very impressive for that time, given that there was no 3200 speed film, which didn't arrive on the market until 1986, some 10 years after the release of this camera. It was a lift and turn affair, so you would lift the outer ring of the dial, figure out what your film speed was, and of course then drop the dial back into place. This had a hot shoe, a traditional hot shoe. You can see that it has a single contact point, as most cameras did at the time. This really was, I think, this would have been before the era of dedicated flash units. Off to the side, you have a single flash synchronization port. However, you did have this switchable, this little movable switch. So you either change it to FP, which is focal plane, which really signifies bulb flash, to X. X would be for electronic flash synchronization. Over here on the other side, you have two things. You have this little plunger here, and this plunger is a depth of field preview. The depth of field preview, now notice, when I press that, nothing happens, right? With this camera, the depth of field preview only works if you've advanced the film. Now when I press that, you can see how that closes down the closes the lens to its working aperture. With the depth of field plunger, this is a press one and release, and it stays in place. Press again, and it opens the lens. As I mentioned, this model was released in 1975. The version that was released in 1978, with that camera, you have to, that's a press and hold depth of field preview. If you're ever wondering, do I have one of the earlier models or the later model, this will tell you. And remember, this only works when the film has been advanced and the shutter has been tensioned. To release the lens on all of these Minolta cameras, you'll see this small little button here. Just press down on that, twist the lens to the left, and then you can remove the lens. These cameras are a bit different in that the cushion is on this movable flap. So that is slightly different from other models. CLC was an indication of the type of meter that it used. In this case, it's CLC stood for contrast light compensation. This was a cadmium sulfide meter, and once powered up, you can tell because the meter sweeps across this range rather leisurely, or what we consider to be rather leisurely. Of course, the CDS meters, cadmium sulfide meters, replaced the selenium meter, and at that point, I think it probably felt pretty modern. However, these are battery dependent meters, but the battery only operated the meter and nothing else in the camera. To mount the lens on these cameras, you align the red dot on the lens with the red dot on the camera and twist to the right. There were numerous variations of the Rocore lenses. I am by no means an expert on these lenses, so I'm going to provide a link to a website that really covers it very thoroughly. On the back of the camera, it's fairly plain. You did have this little frame here to hold the end of the box. You'll also notice that it had a DIN to ASA conversion chart. In many cases, film in those days would be marked in both DIN and ASA. DIN was the European film rating scale, and ASA was the Western, generally thought of as the American film rating scale. ASA eventually became ISO. On the bottom of the camera, it's fairly simple. Here's your tripod socket. It is in alignment with the center of the lens. Over here, you have a press and release rewind button. This is the cover for the battery chamber. You'll notice that this is different because you don't need a coin. Because of the crosshatch pattern, it's very simple to remove. You can just use your thumb, apply some pressure to it, and then when you get close, you can simply rotate that outward. This used the old PX13 625 mercury cell, no longer available. This small battery adapter contains a diode that lowers the voltage to 1.35 volts from the modern cell's voltage of 1.5 volts. You can either slip in a silver oxide or a lithium battery. I think in most cases I've used silver oxide. The small adapter replicates the shape of the original PX13 625 mercury cell. Now over here is a 3-position switch. You're either off, you're on, this is for turning the meter on, this controls only the meter, and battery check. When you turn it to battery check, the meter should hover near this small little black indicator in the viewfinder. And I'll put a photo of that right now. Speaking of the viewfinder is fairly large. It had a nice split image in the middle, surrounded by that I believe to be a microprism on a ground glass screen. Underneath the viewfinder is a series of numbers, and those are your shutter speeds. And you'll see there's a small little brace that indicates the selected shutter speed. Above the viewfinder is the aperture, and that reads right off of the aperture of the lens. And it does that. Pull this lens real quickly. And it reads that by using this small window right here. So it's reading directly from the lens. On the right side of the viewfinder, you'll see your match needle system. The needle will then float up and down on the right side, and you then adjust either your shutter speed or your aperture until the eye sits over the needle. And that's called a match needle system. Fairly simple, and it's fairly accurate. One other thing that I wanted to mention is this small indicator here. This small indicator moves when your film is being loaded. If your film isn't loaded correctly, the little indicator in there doesn't show up. Of course, what most of us would do back in the old days of film, after you load the film, you would take up whatever slack would be in the film, and then when you fired off your two blanks, what should happen is you should see the crank move each time you advance the film. If the rewind crank didn't rotate, it meant the film wasn't loaded correctly. As I mentioned early in this video, there were several models of the SR-T cameras. I don't have any of the original SR-T series. I believe those were called the SR-T MC. Yes, SR-T MC and then SR-T SC. Then that was followed by the SR-T 100 series. There was a 100, 101, and 102, with the 102 being roughly equivalent to the 202. The 100 series was then followed by the 200 series, the 200, the 201, and the 202. There are some changes here in how the nameplate is displayed in the prism housing, but they're pretty much the same camera. Aside from that, they're built on the same body shell. With these two cameras placed up against each other, you can really see the similarities here. You can see shutter speed placement, film advance and shutter speed and shutter release placement. Also the frame counter, same location. Obviously this is going to be in the same location because why wouldn't it? The biggest change from the 100 to 200 series is if you look, is the inclusion of a traditional hot shoe, whereas this one just had an accessory shoe. So that meant you could use this easily with any flash unit. All you had to do was slide the flash unit into the shoe. With this camera, of course, you could still use an electronic flash unit, but you would have to plug it in here, or you would have to slide it into the shoe, then take a cable and connect it to the side of the camera. With the older 100 series, you'll notice that there are two connection ports here, one for bulb flash, FP, and the other one for electronic flash, X. Now, when we get to the 200 versus the 202, aside from the small crease in the top deck, which may or may not be visible, the cameras really do take on quite an identical look. And here is the 201 versus the 202. You can see some changes right here in the prism housing. So with this prism housing, it seems to be a little bit narrower here, just a slightly different shape. However, with all three cameras, the 200, the 201, and the 202, all three of them had traditional hot shoes and placement of shutter speed dials, and everything else really looked identical. The primary difference between the three was in the amount of information that was visible in the viewfinder. In the 200 model, there was no information about either shutter speeds or apertures. In the 201, there was the small shutter speed scale, but it did not have the window for displaying the aperture. And in the 202, as we've already seen, this had the shutter speed scale underneath the focusing screen, plus the aperture display above the focusing screen. So that's the primary difference between these three models. Well, with that said, let's take a look. Well, you know what? Before we move on to the weight, let's open up the back of one of these cameras. And we'll open up the 202 because that's the one that I've replaced the foam seals on. With the 202, the back opens traditionally. Simply pull up on the rewind knob, and the back pops open. Aside from this small ding here, there are no surprises. Here you have a pressure plate, and film runs traditionally from left to right. Real quickly, look at the Model 100, and you'll see that there aren't a whole lot of differences between the 100 and the 200. In both of them, they have this small slotted sleeve that runs around the take-up spool, and that is where you tuck your film leader. Both cameras use, well, all of the cameras use a horizontally traveling cloth shutter. These all had your polished film rails, and of course the pressure plates were pretty much the same shape, and same location, and of course, why wouldn't they be? The role of the pressure plate, of course, is to keep the film flat against the film rail, so when you take your photograph, the film is as flat as possible, and you will get a sharp image, corner to corner, edge to edge, always dependent upon the taking lens being of sufficient quality to record a sharp image. So one notable difference between some of the other models is you'll notice this small little circular scale. That is your DIN to ASA conversion chart, which is also present on the 200 model, but not present on the 201. The 201 and 202 both use this small little conversion chart that has a small frame to hold the end of the box of your camera. With that out of the way, let's take a look and see what these cameras weigh. I'm going to weigh all these without the lenses because I think if I were to put different lenses on different bodies, you would end up with different weights. This way we can look and just see what the bodies weigh. The 202 comes in at 1 pound 9 ounces. 1 pound 9 ounces. Now, how about the 201? 201 comes in at 1 pound 8.5 ounces, so half an ounce less. How about the 200? I'm going to guess that it weighs a little bit less. 1 pound 7.6 ounces. So what is that? 1 ounce difference and then half an ounce difference. Well, just for fun, let's weigh the SR-T 100. See what that weighs. That weighs 1 pound 8.3 ounces. They're all roughly within the same neighborhood, with the lower models weighing less and the 202 weighing the most, but it's not a significant amount of weight. And in fact, most people probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference between 1 pound 8.3 ounces and 1 pound 9 ounces. So years ago, I had an SRT 202, and I had with it a standard 50 millimeter lens. I know I had a 35 millimeter wide angle, and I had the 135 telephoto. I can't recall if I sold that camera or if I gave it away. I think I might have sold that. And then, of course, as often happens, you sort of regret selling it, so I went out and bought another one. This one wasn't in quite as good physical shape. It has a few scuffs here and there, and you'll notice that the viewfinder has a defect in it, and that is that the shutter speed scale was attached in an angle. So I had it open, and I tried to pull that scale back into a horizontal position. Didn't seem to work, but I will give it another try at some point. Production of the SRT 202 never really made it past the late 70s and was replaced, of course, by the X models. And in a previous video, already took a look at one of my favorite cameras, and that would be the XD11. Without getting too far into it, this was the first multi-mode camera to arrive on the market. It was highly electronic and also battery dependent. It also was a much smaller camera. That was all part of the downsizing of the industry that took place thanks to the success of the Olympus OM1 and OM2. Compared with the SRT cameras, let's take a quick look at them. And you can see how the 202 is a much taller camera than the XD11. Let's see if it's any wider. I'm going to guess that it is, because it certainly would make sense that it is. And you can see, yes, this definitely is a full-size camera. It's both taller and wider than the XD11. I'm sure it's heavier. Once again, let's just weigh the two bodies. Let's weigh the XD11. We already know that the 202 came in at 1 pound 9 ounces, so the XD11 comes in at 1 pound 3.7 ounces, or 1 pound 4 ounces, which is 5 ounces lighter than the 202. Now, 5 ounces lighter, that is a difference that you would notice. One of the nice things about these cameras today is that there is a lot of really good Minolta glass out there, that is Minolta lenses. And generally, they're not too expensive. I have a small group of lenses. For some reason, I don't have a wide angle. I have a lot of 50s. So I have this version, which is an MC 1.7. And then I have the MD 1.7. And then at some point, I picked up the MD 1.4. I also found the compact 45 millimeter. This is an f2 lens. And I don't recall where I got this from, but I also have this fairly compact 135 millimeter lens. This is the older Celtic lenses, or Celtic. Depends on how that should be pronounced, right? Should it be Celtic, as in Ireland Celtic, or should it be Celtic, as in Boston Celtics? The Americanization of many words can sometimes be confounding and baffling and nonsensical. So this has its own built-in lens shade, as many 135 millimeter lenses did. It's fairly compact and seems to be pretty high quality. I don't think I've shot with this lens yet. So my final rating for the Minolta SR-T 202 is 9.0. I think these were pretty well made cameras. Unfortunately, a lot of them weren't really treated well through the years. So if you're in the market for one, always keep an eye on the condition, the physical condition. In general, they've held up pretty well. Sometimes you'll see some small corrosion in the crease here with the where the viewfinder meets the flat of the top deck. Almost certainly, and without a doubt, you are going to have to replace that foam cushion for the mirror bumper, and you'll have to replace your foam seals. I did both of these. Didn't take me that long. I also cleaned up the viewfinder a bit. Like I said, I want to work on that shutter speed scale and straighten that up. The body coverings on these cameras seem to have also held up pretty well. It's like this leather, or I guess you could call it a pebble leather finish. And it works very well. It's very easy to grip the camera. Other camera makers used a similar type of leatherette covering, so there's nothing unique about it. Ironically, it's held up much better than the XD11. On almost all of those cameras, the body covering has shrunk to the point where it has to be removed. In fact, the body covering in most of those cameras not only has it shrunk, but it was more susceptible to damage, like small little dings or something could actually tear the covering or the surface of the covering. So I would certainly consider this to be a viable alternative to the Pentax K1000. That's a very popular camera these days. And the reason is because these often can be had for roughly the same amount of money, but the split image in the viewfinder plus the addition of your shutter speed scale and also your aperture, while still using the same CDS, cadmium sulfide meter, plus the addition of a depth of field preview lever and a self-timer, certainly make this, I think, a better option than the K1000. And there's plenty of lenses for each camera, obviously, including those made by third parties such as Tokina, Vivitar, Tamron, Sigma, etc., etc. So here we have it. This is the Minolta SR-T 202, a full-size camera that was produced in the mid to late 1970s. Still a viable camera today, and certainly one that I would have no problem recommending to a starting photographer. And that brings us to the end of this video. If you enjoyed this video, think about giving me a like on it, or if you'd like to leave a comment about this camera, you can do so in the comments below. If you have any suggestions on any future content, you can send me an email at contact@camera-talk.net. Click on the icon in the lower right corner of the screen for more videos about cameras and photography. And I'll see you on the next video.